there really is a new science of happiness.
There is a new science of happiness, but you know that. A colleague of mine at the University of Pennsylvania, Martin Seligman, had a lot to do with giving it shape. He defined a field that's come to be called positive psychology. And the question is not how do you move people from -6 to 0 on some well-being scale, but rather how do you move them from +2 to +7, which psychology had completely ignored. But when he writes books about this, he doesn't call his books happiness. He calls his book authentic happiness, to distinguish it from the yellow smiley face kind of happiness that he assumes that most people have in mind. So there is now a lot of information out there about what promotes well-being, and none of it is easy. It's work you care about and you feel you're actually achieving something in. It's close relations with other people. It is not easy to develop and sustain close relations with other people. Those things take work. The easy stuff, the stuff that puts a temporary smile on your face, doesn't produce, quote, authentic happiness. But at the same time, there are books that kind of try to tell you it's hard, but here are a few shortcuts. Sure. And that, unfortunately, conveys, just feeds into the notion that happiness is easily attained, and there's a romantic attachment to misery and suffering. For years, one of Seligman's main obstacles was to convince people, of Darren's point, that to be happy does not mean that you're an idiot. Look, most people have this view that every artist worth taking seriously, every novelist, every composer, every painter worth taking seriously was miserable, and the suffering of the artist is what produced the art. As an empirical matter, this is false. There are people like that. There is Van Gogh, but there are also plenty of people who are not miserable who produce great art. But we have really just assumed that if you think deeply, you can't help but see the tragedy that is the world, and that is the human condition. And if you don't see that tragedy, it's because you're superficial. It takes a lot to overcome that bias, which is essentially baked into the culture, I would say.
So do you think, if we all know people who just seem sort of naturally happy, do you think people are kind of born that way? Do you have a genetic
There's evidence.
predisposition towards that, or is it something that they've worked at?
Well, there's evidence that approximately half the variation among individuals in well-being in happiness defined as positive affect, high positive affect, low negative affect, and stuff like that. About half of the variation is genetic, the evidence suggests. About 10%, this is astonishing, is a function of what actually happens to you in your life. 10%. That's minuscule.
Where you live, who you're married to, that kind of stuff,
whether
right?
you get into Harvard or you don't get into Harvard, that whether your marriage falls apart or your marriage is successful. These gigantic things, 10%. And so what's the remaining 40%? The remaining 40% is how you interpret the things that happen in your life. And that, the argument goes, is trainable. You can't change your genes.
We agree.
What happens to you is as much a chance as anything else. It's out of your hands. But 40% is a huge amount that you have control over by, for example, being satisfied that you've eliminated 80% of global warming instead of pissed off that you didn't eliminate 100% of global warming. By being thrilled that you got into Brown rather than crushed that you didn't get into Harvard. So the way in which we construe the things that happen to us, and you can learn to do these construals in a helpful to your own well-being way or a destructive way, is where most of the action is, at least according to, and these are trainable. You can sort of do cognitive behavior therapy for non-pathological people to move yourself from 0 to +6.
Isn't there another word for this? Resilience?
Well, resilience
in a way
is a little different.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's sort of like, are you going to sort of obsess over the things that seem to have gone wrong, or are you going to sort of get on with things?
I mean, yes, but I think resilience is not so much about how you construe bad things that have happened. It's about how you respond to those bad things. Do you pick yourself up off the mat, or do you wallow in misery? So resilient people are people who can experience disappointment and failure and turn up for work the next day and try to get past their obstacles.